Hi, everybody. Welcome to Certified Local Government 101. My name is Michelle Thompson. I am the CLG coordinator for the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. I'm from Olympia, but I actually live in Cheney outside of Spokane, and both of those communities are part of the Certified Local Government program. A little bit of history of historic preservation before we get started. In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was signed into law. That is, and is to this day, the strongest piece of legislation that we have in the United States to protect our historic resources. So what the heck is Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, DAP? So there's kind of three parts of DAP: the Built Environment Unit, the Archaeological Unit, and the Anthropology Unit. So I am part of the Built Environment Unit at DAP. So we look at anything that is old, historic, above ground. Archaeologists, that's kind of self-explanatory. And then we have the anthropologists, and we actually have a human remains lab in the basement of our building. And this is our building here on the screen. We're in the old Thurston County Courthouse, historic building, of course. We're down in the basement. And this is located right across the street from the state capitol building, also a historic campus. So if you're ever in Olympia and want to come say hi to some people in the office, this is the place to go. So I kind of always say this about DAP, kind of the easiest way to say this: if it's old and it is important or precious, and there's some way to protect it in the state of Washington, that's what DAP does. That's who we are. So what the heck is a CLG? What's a certified local government? So certified local government simply means that your local historic preservation commission is one that is certified by the National Park Service. It's an accreditation. So the National Park Service is the agency that runs the federal historic preservation program. So you'll see that National Park Service logo on a lot of things that has to do with historic preservation. What does a CLG do? So they do lots of things, but here's kind of the basics. They promote preservation and educate local citizens about its benefits. They survey. So as a CLG, you want to hire consultants with CLG grant money to inventory your buildings and other resources, bridges, grain silos, that kind of stuff. It's not just limited to buildings, to see what's eligible for a register. You want to add buildings to the local register. You want to review changes to buildings on the local register. That's called a design review. You want to review special tax valuation applications. And you want to review National Register nominations. Now, you don't review changes to buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You only review changes to buildings listed on your local Register of Historic Places, but you do review the nominations of the National Register of Historic Places. Why did you become a CLG to begin with? So a CLG is something that your community actually had to go out for. This is not something that you were just chosen, not something that you were chosen for. You actually had to become a CLG or want to become a CLG. So one of the main reasons is because you get direct technical assistance from DAP, like this training. I will also come to your community if you want me to come do a Q&A, if you want me to do a training, on design review, on special tax valuation. If you want me to do this presentation for your community, I will actually come to you. I can do it virtually, or I can do it in person and come do a training for you. So we also have in the built environment unit, the state architectural historian, the state historical architect. So I can bring some of my colleagues along with me too, to talk to you about various different subjects. All you have to do is ask. There are annual grants that are only available to certified local governments, and we'll talk more about those in just a moment. And I truly believe this: you became a CLG because your town is cool and unique and has neat historic buildings that are worth fighting for. Definitely believe that. So, a little bit of background. There are three possible historic registers. You might have seen plaques for each. Kind of the most common one that you might see is the National Register of Historic Places. That's at the federal level. That program is run by the National Park Service. Um, the DAP has the Washington State Heritage Register, so that's at the state level. And then you have your local register. So there are three different registers. The only register where a property is undergoes a review when there are changes to that property is your local register. So the National Register does not automatically have review. The National Park Service, DAP, we don't come in and review changes to buildings listed on the National Register. The state register, DAP, does not review changes to buildings on the state register, but you do review changes to buildings listed on your local register. So it's kind of the reason that you have a local register, so you can review changes. There are financial incentives for each one of these registers. Your local register may or may not require owner consent to be added to the register. More commonly than not, you require owner consent to be added to the local register, but consult your ordinance if you're unsure. So just like there are three possible historic registers, there are three possible historic districts. Again, the national, state, and local. Historic districts are a way to add a bunch of related resources to a register at once. So a building or a resource in a district is either called contributing or non-contributing. So contributing buildings are entitled to all the benefits of a building that's individually listed on a register. So contributing just basically means that, it's at least 50 years old. It has most of its original kind of materials and parts. It's what we call integrity. We'll talk about this a little bit more. And it's actually, when you're trying to tell a story of the district, why the district is important, why you're nominating the district, that those resources actually help to tell that story. So that means contributing or not contributing. Historic districts are usually created by vote. National Register, that's definitely true. And for your local register, you should have something in your local ordinance that tells you how to create a local register. It might say something like you have a simple majority. So maybe 50% plus one of the building owners within a district have to agree to the district. Again, your ordinances are all a little different. So consult your ordinance to see what your local process is for adding things to or for creating a local historic district. Oops. So keep talking about local. So the National Register of Historic Places is harder to get onto than your local register, but it actually has less protections than your local register does. So kind of the whole reason why your local register exists is so you can do a review of changes. So your Historic Preservation Commission can do a review of changes listed on the local register, because you cannot, by that National Historic Preservation Act, by federal law, you cannot review changes to buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is honorary only. Your local register is not honorary. That's where you actually have the ability to review changes to buildings on your local register. So if you're trying to protect a building, if you're trying to have some local eyes on changes to a building, you want it to be listed on your local register. And a resource can be listed on all three of those registers. It can be listed on the national, state, and local register. But if you're going to do a design review to changes of a resource, you're doing it because it's listed on the local register. So we don't do things like when we have something added to the national register, you don't automatically add it to the local register. That's not how that's not how that works. You want to actually undergo the nomination process that's laid out in your ordinance for adding something to your local register. So those CLG grants I talked about just a few minutes ago. So every year, my agency, DAP, gets a certain amount of money to run the historic preservation program at the state level. And by that National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, 10% of the money that we get to run the state program every year has to go to CLG grants. So you all are able to compete for grants every year because you're part of the CLG program. Those grants are competitive, like I said, but you're very likely to receive one if you apply. This last year, we had more people ask for money than we had money available. But the 2 years previous, we had more money available than we had people ask for it. So I was scrambling to try to get that 10% met to make sure that we were spending our 10% because we have to spend it on the CLGs. So they're fairly easy to apply for. They come out in January and they close in April. If we have the money, you're more likely than not to get a CLG grant. So they're very much worth applying for. You can use them for a lot of things. You can use them to hire a consultant to survey your historic buildings. So you survey your historic buildings to see what's eligible for one of those three registers, the national, state, or local register. When you hire a consultant, they'll tell you that which buildings are eligible for which registers. You can use grant money for educational materials. You can use it for national and local register nominations. So if you want to write a nomination to the National Register of Historic Places for a building, you can actually hire a consultant with that CLG money to do it for you. If you want to create a national or local register historic district, you can hire a consultant to come in and write the nomination for you with that CLG money. People use it for preservation plans and much, much more. There's lots of stuff that you can use that CLG grant money for. If you're unsure, just get in touch with me. I'll have my contact information at the very end of the slide presentation. Get in touch with me if you've got questions about what you think you might want to use that money for. So if there's one thing I would like you to go away with after this presentation is to know to please, please, please read your ordinance. That is the most important thing that you can possibly do, is read your ordinance. So all of the ordinances for the CLG program in Washington State are based on a template, but they're all a little bit different. So they're based on a template so that you can cover all your bases, that you kind of meet all the historic preservation laws for federal law and Washington State procedures. But most CLGs have altered those a little bit. So you really want to make sure that you read your historic preservation ordinance. It's what gives you your powers as a historic preservation commission, and it's also what gives you your limitations. Oops. So your historic preservation ordinance is going to say three things. It's going to say that in order to be listed on your local register, a resource has to have something called integrity. It needs to be at least 50 years old, and it needs to fall into sometimes two categories. A lot of times it's just one category in order to be eligible for listing on your local register. So these are some pretty common ones here. A building may be associated with important events that have contributed significantly to the broad patterns of our history. A building might be associated with the lives of persons significant to our past. It might embody distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master, or possess high artistic values, or represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. If you read the beginning of this paragraph here, embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. What that means is that it doesn't mean that it needs to be an architecturally designed. It doesn't need to be Frank Lloyd Wright designed the building for it to be eligible for your register. That certainly could be the case, but it just needs to have distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. So it may just be a really good example of a craftsman. So we keep talking about that term integrity, and integrity we can kind of get in the weeds with that a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit more about this and kind of how we look at integrity. But just kind of as an overall, when we're looking at the physical integrity of a building, that's very different than the condition of a building. So the building that is brick on your screen here, that actually has good physical integrity. It's in poor condition with good physical integrity. So that's a bonus for that building, right? The condition can be altered, but the original materials that, you've got your original windows and shutters, the brick, um, that dorm room window, the original porch, it's missing some pieces, some things have kind of fallen off of it, but it actually has good physical integrity. The gray building, on the other hand, is in really good condition. Clearly somebody's caring a lot more for that building, but it's lost a lot of its physical integrity. It's got vinyl windows, vinyl siding, that porch is made of vinyl. They're both older buildings, they're both historic buildings. It's just one has good integrity and the other does not. So when we're looking at integrity, it really kind of depends on the criteria for which the resource is being nominated. Remember, we talked about the criteria. Is it being nominated for a person? Is it being nominated for an event? Is it being nominated because of its architecture, because it's a good example of a craftsman building, or because it was designed by a famous architect, or a locally well-known architect? In the cases where we're looking at the architecture of the building, when you're nominating something because of its architecture, we're looking at these first three, we call them aspects of integrity. We're looking at the design, the materials, and the workmanship, right? Just like that last building that we looked at, this has really good integrity. You could nominate this to the local register because of it being a really good example, of this kind of period of building, because it has its original windows and brick and dormer and porch and all of that. So that's when we're looking at architectural integrity. When we're looking at something more like location, setting, feeling, association, these other aspects of integrity, those have to do more with when we're nominating something because, maybe an event took place or a person was associated with a building. So this building, this gray building, maybe that's where the first mayor of your town lived, and maybe it doesn't really have really great architectural integrity, but it still has integrity of location. It's still the association. It's still, where the person actually lives. So we still have integrity of location, association, maybe the setting, right? Maybe it's an old farmstead, it's still kind of a rural area where the person actually lived and maybe conducted, their work. It's the still has the same feeling. So that's kind of more important when we're looking at things like a person that was associated with a resource, or an event associated with a resource. Then we care more about the integrity of location, setting, feeling, association. We call this weighting integrity. So everything begins with a really good, thorough nomination form. When you nominate a building to the local register, you want to get as much information as you possibly can. If you can, you want historic maps, you want historic and current photos, any drawings that you can get your hands on. Anything that you can find about that building is what you're looking for. And this is where you really want to call out the aspects of the integrity that the building has, right? We're nominating this building, say, because it is a really good example of a colonial revival house. And so we want to talk about all the things that are intact, the integrity that's intact, that make this a really good example of a colonial revival house, right? It's got its original dormers, it's got its original windows, it still has its original plan, right? It hasn't had any additions. So we really want to make sure that we are getting as much information as we possibly can about why we nominated it, right? The integrity that it has and the reasons that we nominated it for, the criteria that we nominated it to the local register for. So this is really common design review language. This comes from the template. This comes from your ordinance template. No person shall change the use, construct any new building or structure, or reconstruct, alter, restore, remodel, repair, move, or demolish any existing property on the local register of historic places or within a historic district on the local register of historic places without review by the commission and without receipt of a certificate of appropriateness, or in the case of demolition, a waiver as a result of the review. Okay, so there's several things kind of going on in this next And this next extract's taken from your local historic preservation ordinance. The review, so the design review, shall apply to all features of the property, interior and exterior. Your particular historic preservation ordinance may give you the ability to look at the interior to also put protections on the interior. You need to look and make sure that's not the case with every single ordinance. Some of them just look at the exterior for protections that contribute to its designation and are listed on the nomination form. So you are reviewing the things that contribute to its designation and that are listed on the nomination form. Information required by the commission to review the proposed changes are established in rules. And what that means is that there should be something in your bylaws that says this is the criteria we use as the Historic Preservation Commission to ensure that historic preservation best practices are being met. Those are usually something called the Secretary of the Interior standards, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. But when it says that something is established in rules, there should be some kind of mention in your bylaws about the Secretary of the Interior standards, or some kind of standards or that you use, guidelines that you use for reviewing changes to resources listed on your local register. So a couple things with design review, you might want to consider a preliminary review. This is something that can be done at a Historic Preservation Commission meeting, but it's not something that, that the applicant pays for. They come in and they have a conversation with you about, what they're thinking of doing to a resource that's listed on your local register. And you help them by saying, well, this will, if you do it this way, or if you think about doing it this way, this is more likely to meet the standards that we have for reviewing changes to buildings on the local register. So it's more congenial, it's more conversational. Another thing I want you to know about design review is that your commission either has advisory or quasi-judicial powers. Advisory is just exactly what it says there. You have the power to advise applicants about changes to their resources listed on the local register, but you do not have the power to say yes or no to a permit. Usually you are advising the applicant, but you are also kind of putting that information for your advice forward to maybe the city planner. So quasi-judicial means that your commission has the power to say yes or no to a building permit. So know which one it is. If you're unsure, you really want to consult with your city attorney. Decisions should never be arbitrary. So you really want to follow whatever guidelines you have in your ordinance or in your bylaws that say these are the standards that we use for conducting a design review. You need to stick with those standards, whatever they are. So you want to be careful about setting precedent. So that's why we have standards for design review. We want to be careful about saying things like, I don't want another coffee shop in that building. I don't like the way that looks is not being arbitrary. You want to be very clear, and you want to follow your guidelines you have for conducting a design review. And so those very well may be the guidelines that you have for conducting a design review very well may be what's known as the Secretary of the Interior standards. These are put out by the National Park Service, and they are 10 practical guidelines that emphasize repair over replace. So we're going to go through those. Standard 1, a property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So we see here a church that's been changed into a restaurant. That is an appropriate reuse for this building, right? They didn't have to go in and knock down those columns. They didn't have to take out the stained glass, right? This was a good reuse for this historic church. Standard 2, the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alterations of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. Standard 3, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. Standard 4, this is my favorite standard. Most properties change over time. Those changes have acquired historic significance in their own right, and shall be retained and preserved. So you see this building here, it looks like it was built in 1879, but it had a facelift in the 1940s or the 1950s. It was really common. There was a craze in the middle of the 20th century to give facelifts to the bottom floor of these historic buildings because people didn't appreciate them in the same way that we appreciate them today. So people thought that they were doing a good thing, and for some of us, they really were. So some people love that facelift. I particularly have an affinity for that style and think that it's really nice looking. So it kind of just goes to show that style and taste and stuff, it comes in, it comes out, and it's definitely subjective. So with a situation like this, if you have an applicant and they come in and they say that they want to get rid of this bottom storefront, you really want to think about, okay, well, when was this building significant? Was the most significance of this building, was it during, 1879? Was it when the older building was there? Or has the bottom floor, has that retained some significance in its own right? So it's kind of complicated. If you run into a situation like this, you can get in touch with me and we can have a conversation about it. Standard 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. Standard 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. Standard 6, chemical or physical treatment, such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials, shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Standard 8, significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. Point being, if you uncover any archaeology when you're doing work on, or anthropology when you're doing anything on a historic building, please contact DAP right away. Standard 9, new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So this is actually a good example here of a historic addition or an addition to a historic building, right? This is clearly an addition. Nobody's going to mistake this for part of the original building. We're not creating a false sense of history here. And it's also, the addition is not kind of overwhelming the historic building. So it's compatible with it. So good example of a addition. Standard 10, new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So you can see here in this photo, this is a really great, or this rendering, that, somebody's showing these historic buildings, and there's a brand new building right there, smack in the middle of these historic buildings, but it's, it's the massing, the size, the setback are all pretty compatible with the buildings around it. We can have new buildings in historic districts. We want new buildings in historic districts. We want housing, we want density, ADUs, all of that stuff is compatible with historic preservation. We just want to make sure that it is compatible with the character of the neighborhood, the surrounding buildings. So as I've said several times, register listing cannot necessarily save a building, but it does open up financial incentives. So being listed on the National Register of Historic Places, as I said earlier, is honorary only. It does not prevent a building from being changed. There's no review to buildings listed. There's no automatic review to buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places, even for demolition. So you can demolish stuff listed on the National Register. So there's more of a carrot approach than a stick approach with the National Register. And we use financial incentives to try to get people to do right by their historic buildings. So I just kind of said this already, but rule of thumb, a building must be listed on a register to receive financial incentives. So just a few things that I want you to know about. I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but I do want you to know that they exist. Federal historic tax credits. They're a 20% federal income tax credit. They are for income producing buildings, and they are for buildings listed on the National Register or contributing to a National Register district. Remember, we talked about contributing earlier. The project needs to be substantial. So somebody's putting a lot of money into these buildings. Unfortunately, that's the case right now. We don't have incentives that are, just because something is listed on a register. People actually have to be doing work on the building to qualify for these incentives. So if you come across a building, you've got a warehouse in your downtown that somebody is turning into a restaurant, and you think, hey, this historic building really could benefit from federal historic tax credits, get in touch with me. My colleague here at DAP is somebody that actually does nothing else but federal historic tax credits. So I will get you in touch with them, and they can walk you through the process. Just want you to know that they exist. Special tax valuation. This is an adjustment to property taxes for a lowering of property taxes for 10 to 24 years. So 10 years is the standard, but in economically distressed counties, in communities under 20,000 people, the special tax valuation can be applied for up to 24 years. And these are for income producing, so commercial or residential buildings. And it needs to be listed on your local register or contributing to a local registered district. So this is special tax valuation is unique to Washington State. Again, project must be substantial, so you have to put money into the project in order to get this kind of lowering of your taxes. If you have questions about special tax valuation, please get in touch with me. And again, I'll have my information at the very end of this presentation. I want you to know that there are lots of grants out there. Again, the rule of thumb is you want to get listed on a register so that you are already eligible for grants. You don't have to get listed on the register to be eligible for, or you don't want to have to go through the process of getting listed on a register to be eligible for grants. You want to kind of get in front of that. So you already have your buildings listed on a register so that when these grants come up, that you can apply for them. So lots of things: historic courthouse grants, cemeteries, theaters, barns, something called the Savinsky grant. The National Park Service comes out with grants all the time. So again, just remember that rule of thumb. You want to list so that you can get so that you can be eligible for grants and financial incentives. Couple things I want you to be aware of: some resources. A Field Guide to American Houses. That's something that I think that every Historic Preservation Commission should have a copy of. There's something called the Preservation Briefs, and these actually are a companion to the Secretary of the Interior Standards. So the Secretary of the Interior Standards are meant to be very broad. They are meant to be used anywhere from like the White House to a shack. But preservation briefs give us much more kind of like minutia of topics. So if you're looking at historic masonry, maybe leaded glass windows, these things come up in your design review. This is where you want to look at the historic preservation briefs. They'll give you really guided advice for dealing with specific topics. Oops. Please know that recently I completed the Washington State Certified Local Government Program Handbook. That's actually on our website. You can find that in the CLG portion of DAP's website. And I'm going to be doing a design review webinar just like this, but on design review, open to all CLGs. It's going to be virtual, and it will be Wednesday, January 13th at 3 p.m. And I will be sending out some links to that on the emails that you get from me. And there is my contact information, Michelle Thompson, CLG coordinator. Michelle.thompson@dap.wa.gov. There's my phone number. Please get a hold of me if you've got any questions about anything that I talked about in this presentation, or anything else you want clarification, you want me to come to your town and do a presentation. I would love to do that. I'd be very happy to do that. So yeah, thank you.